Hello, everybody. Hey, how you doing today? My name is Tim Weigel. Today we're going to be covering spirits production, essentially spirits 101, and we're going to be delving into the specifics of it all. Give me a second here. Bear with me while I share my screen so you can see the presentation. Okay, there we are. Okay, so we're going to start with the history of alcohol and manufacturing of spirits. Again, we're going to learn about how alcohol is made. And just a couple things here. First of all, what are we talking about today? What are the key takeaways? So we're going to talk about the definition of alcohol, history of alcohol, essential ingredients, production of spirits, and packaging. There's a lot to unpack there, pun intended. So let's get right to it. A quick note, the topics we'll be talking about today will be done with a broad stroke. The following lessons and weeks that are laid before us, we'll be getting into deep dives about specific topics. But today we're just going to be talking about very broad generalizations and things like that. So let's get to it. First of all, a timeline of booze. So let's start back in the 6500 BC. Mead was being made in northern China. Mead is essentially fermented honey. This mead production is actually 2,000 years older than the invention of the wheel. So alcoholic product beverages have been with us for a long time. It's natural. There is yeast everywhere in the air, so it's quite natural that it would ferment sweet things that were just hanging around, basically. There's a lot more to it than that, and our ancestors didn't really understand what was going on. They just drank it, and nice things happened to them, and it was delicious sometimes. Sometimes it wasn't. But moving on from that, we also know during 7000 BC that wine was being made in modern-day Iraq and Turkey. 3500 BC, we see Indian Sanskrit documents showing evidence of several different types of alcohols. Okay. 3000 BC, we find evidence of straws, drinking straws that were used to drink and consume beer, maybe other beverages as well. In 1324, it was common practice to bury Egyptian pharaohs. So King Tut tomb contained vessels of red and white wine. We know this because this was archaeologists went and dug up the pharaohs' burial places and found remnants of these red and white wines within these vessels. Moving on to 384 to 322 BC, we see the Greek philosopher Aristotle stated in his tome Meteorology that seawater can be made potable by distillation. Okay, so distillation processes were being used in our history, not just for alcohol production, for perfume production. And distillation just means to separate things out. You want to distill things down to what you want. So you're separating things out. In the case of alcohol production and some other different production, heat is applied very simply. And we'll get to that later. In the 8th century, we see the word alcohol. It stems from the Arabic word alcohol. This 8th century term means ghost or ethereal body. Another interpretation could be, in essence, or further reference to the separation and purification obtained by distillation. In the 10th century, we see a more modern history of distillation and is considered to have originated with the Arabs or Saracens. They gave us the words alcohol and alembic, the latter meaning a still. So when you see like a pot still, it's also referred to as an alembic. So that That word just essentially means a still, or a tool used to distill certain things. We also see the alcohol being attributed to an Arabian alchemist, Albucasan. The Arabic method of distillation was transmitted to Western Europe through the Moorish invasions. And that was around the 10th century that actually it was a little bit before that, the Moors came in and conquered throughout Europe, and they brought with them the knowledge of distillation. And that carried through into the British Isles and things like that. In 1405, we see Ireland whiskey dubbed aquavitae, which was later derived into the Gaelic word uscabe or uscabetha, which translated down to water of life. And you'll see this term come across a lot of different terms for alcohol, things like that. This would later be shortened to whiskey. So in the beginning of the 19th century, we see a big change. I'm sorry, backing up into the 16th century, I'm sorry. We see tequila being distilled. During this time in pre-colonial Mexico, the natives, the Zapotecs, and all throughout Mexico they would ferment certain types of agave, and this agave syrup, and they would ferment it and it become known as pulque. Well, when the Spanish came and colonized Mexico during the 16th century, they had already been distilling brandy in Spain. So they brought this knowledge and the equipment with them, and they started distilling this pulque into agave spirits. Now, there are certain schools of thought that distillation might have been there before the Europeans came. We'll kind of delve into that later, but for sake of brevity, we'll move on. In 1605, in 1650, we see gin being developed after the British came back from the East India Wars. They really liked the flavor of certain Geneva flavored distilled spirits, and they tried to replicate it and to certain effects, and it became refined. And then in the 17th century, we see the rum trade being in effect, which was kind of a blight on the spirits industry because it involved slave trade too. So we'll get into that more, but rum was being developed throughout the 17th century. Then we see in the beginning of the 19th century, early versions of the column still were being developed and improved upon. You start with the Stein still, and eventually the patent still, and then the coffee still. Before that, people were using pot stills and very crude versions of stills, and we'll talk about those more later. But that was a big improvement upon the distillation world and the production of alcohol. So moving on from that, we're going to be talking about fermentation, okay? So alcoholic beverages are produced through an anaerobic fermentation of plant-derived carbohydrate materials. Well, what does that mean? Anaerobic means there's no oxygen, so this fermentation is taking place in no oxygen environment, okay? And these plant-derived carbohydrate materials are essentially sugars developed from and converted from, sometimes from plants, okay? Sugars are converted to ethyl alcohol or ethanol and carbon dioxide through the induced or natural inclusion of the yeast. So if you look at the top picture there, we see what we need. It's a simple equation. We take the sugar, add the yeast in a non-oxygen environment. We combine those together and we get carbon dioxide, most importantly, ethanol and heat, okay? It's a very simplified equation and a simplified diagram. There's a lot going on there, but very simply, that's what fermentation is. The yeast consume the sugar, and through a metabolic process, they essentially pee alcohol and emit carbon dioxide. So it happens too when we eat. So it's a natural process that happens. So where do we get these things? We talked about plant-derived carbohydrate materials. So there's basic raw materials that we're getting these sugars from. The most notable ones that are easier to get are fruits, sugarcane, and honey. These already have sugar. We don't have to do anything. They're right there. So for instance, like grapes, you squeeze the grape, you get the grape juice out. It's got sugars already within it. But sometimes that's not so easy. When we're talking about grains, such as like wheat or barley, they have starches that cannot be consumed by yeast, so it needs to be converted. Okay, and we'll talk about the conversion method later. Same thing with certain types of plants and vegetables, namely agave. When we talk about tequila, again, there's a starch within it that cannot be consumed by yeast, and it has to be converted. Same thing with other vegetables like potatoes and sugar beets. A certain method has to be applied. Usually it's heat to convert that. Okay. The four major categories of alcoholic beverages that are produced, some that we'll touch upon very briefly, but it's not within the scope of this class. It's different classes, but you must know them, okay? So the first one are fermented beverages. What are those? Those are going to be your wines, your beers, things like that. Again, you kind of have to know what they're about to understand what. So if you understand wines, you can definitely understand what brandies are, okay? And if you know what beer is, you can definitely transition into whiskeys quite well. Which leads us to our next point, distilled spirits. So distilled spirits are going to be what we're going to be talking about mostly in this class. Whiskeys, brandies, agave spirits, rum, things like that. Also fortified beverages, okay? The main ones of these are, we'll be talking about them too, very briefly, but these are things, and predominantly they're going to be a wine fortified with some kind of alcohol, typically brandy, doesn't have to be. So fortified beverages, some of the examples of these are going to be sherries, ports, madeiras, things like that. The fourth major category are liqueurs. Again, we'll be devoting a whole week just to these, and it's a very big category. But essentially, it's a spirit, typically a neutral grain spirit, doesn't have to be. And then we add sugar to it and a flavoring. Flavoring could be anything. So some examples of these would be like cream de cacaos, your certain types of just liqueurs and things like that, like a strawberry liqueur. So we'll be talking about those more later. Okay, many countries regulate the production of alcohol produced in their territory and carefully control their taxation. Okay, so preparing fruits for fermentation. There's a couple of ways we can do this, but in the next few slides, we're going to talk about how to prepare the fruits for fermentation. Okay, we want to get those sugars within the fruits to ferment them. Okay, so those juices and things can have sugars that the yeast like to eat. Okay. First thing we gotta do is harvest. Okay, so there's a couple different ways. Harvesting is basically the picking of ripened fruits, vegetables, plants, and/or grains from farms or fields. Okay, this can be done through mechanical harvesting or manual harvesting. Depending on the hardiness of the fruit, grain, or whatever you're trying to pick, your type of harvesting method is going to really play into this, okay? So if we have grains, typically we're going to use mechanical harvesting. If we have very delicate grapes, we're going to use manual harvesting, like in the picture there. So that comes upon the decision of the master distiller, how they want to harvest their raw material. Okay, timing is critical to produce an ideal quality product. Okay, That's very essential for grapes too, fruits, okay? And depending on when you pick it, the balance of accumulated sugars, acids, and other flavor compounds must reach an optimal level. If the raw materials are harvested too soon or too late, it's possible of producing a lower quality product. So if you try to harvest a grape too soon, it's going to be too acidic. Too late, it's going to be too sweet. Okay, so you have to take those things into consideration. Scratting and crushing. Okay, so since all fruit contains sugar, preparing them for fermentation simply involves exposing their sugar to make it available for yeast. Okay, this is done through two different processes. Scratting is usually done for apples, pears, other types of stone fruits like peaches, apricots. And then we also have crushing. This is typically done for grapes and most other fruits where it's more of a delicate process. Yeah. So there's a picture of the different type of apparatuses that are used. On the left, we see a press that is used to separate the skins of the fruit with its solids. So we don't want the solids to be in too much of contact with the juice. Otherwise, the skins are gonna impart a lot of tannins, and then our finished product might be a little too astringent for what we're trying to do. Okay. Also, too, they might be paired together. Something might be scratted and then crushed, or it can be also done separately, depending on what you're trying to make. Okay, on the other side of the fence are grains. So preparing grains for fermentation. So grains are not appropriate to ferment until we trigger a biochemical process that are starch degrading. Okay, as I mentioned before, the starches within grains cannot be fermented by yeast. Okay, we have to convert it. Okay, so one method, or the method that's done, is called malting. So essentially here we're getting the grain to think it's growing and to start to emit the seedlets or the rootlets and expose those sugars, okay? So the fermentation of grain starches can only occur when starches are converted to sugar by the enzyme amylase. This enzyme is present in grain kernels that have been malted, or otherwise known as germinated, okay? So the first step is malting is steeping the grain in water and allowing it to soak for approximately 40 hours and to germinate for around 5 days. So that germination, once you see these rootlets emerge, that's when we know that it has been germinated. And at this point, we need to stop. So what's happening within the cell structure, this changes the microstructure of the cell walls, protein, and starch granules. Okay. So we don't want the grain to keep growing. So there's different methods. We have to next kiln the malt. So we're stopping that germination process, essentially freezing it in time, because we want to be able to ship the grain to the distillers so they can, do the next processes with it. Okay. Also, too, the malt grows through a very high temperature a very high temperature drying in a kiln with gradual temperature increases over several hours. When kilning is complete, the grains are all turned malt, okay? After kilning, the malt will be milled or crushed to break apart the kernels and expose the interior grain. The interior contains the majority of the carbohydrates and the sugars, and this makes it easier to extract the sugars during mashing, okay? In the picture above, this is a malt house where they are turning over the grains or the malt, and to dry it out. It has to be dried out to a certain percentage, okay? And to make it available for packaging and shipping, okay? If it's left wet, it's gonna get moldy and then it's ruined. You cannot use it to make whiskeys and things like that. So he's manually going throughout there and turning over the grains that are on the bottom there so they can get equally dried out. Next step is milling. Essentially, it's the physical act of crushing malt kernels into smaller pieces in preparation for the next step of the process called mashing. Okay. Again, we don't want it to be too fine. Okay. When we add the water during mashing, it's going to turn into just like a big clump. Okay. We don't want it too coarse because then we can't expose those. We'll be losing some efficiency. We want as much surface area of that grain to be exposed so water can, steep all those sugars from the grain. Okay. We almost essentially want like a porridge or a soup of some kind. So as you see here, this gentleman is mashing. So mashing is the steeping of grain in hot water to activate the malt enzymes. Typically, mixed grains may include malted barley with supplemental grains such as corn, sorghum, rye, or wheat, also known as the mash bill. Usually you're going to want malted barley in there because barley is the one grain that has enzymes located on the kernel that can activate this mashing process. With a lot of whiskeys, you're going to see some small portion of barley within it to activate this. Yeah. Mashing allows the enzymes in the malt to break down the starch into sugars, typically maltose, to create a malty liquid called wort. The grain or vegetable is then mixed with hot water in a mash tun to convert the starch into sugar in a process known as saccharification. Okay, very important term there when you're talking about whiskey production. When complete, the mash is cooled down. And that's what we have. So you want it to cool it down as much as possible, okay, to avoid any infection by any bacteria or yeast that you don't intend to want in the wort. Okay, we want to isolate that wort, get it cooled down as much as possible, get it ready for fermentation. Preparing other starches for fermentation. So when we talk about other starches, these are things as roots, vegetables, plants. Big one is agave. Okay. Other things would be like potatoes. So these must go through a conversion process as well, similar to grains, but a little bit different, actually a lot different. When we talk about agave, which is a big one, we're going to have to cook it. So this is the process of adding heat. We heat the raw materials to a high temperature to break down the material and to extract the desired ingredient for fermentation. The process of cooking most often used for agave plants in the production of tequila. It is also adopted in the case of potato, vodkas, and sugar beet items. So on the left side, we see a horno, which is essentially an oven that is cooking the agave and getting it ready for to extract the juice. On the right, we see production of mezcal, which is buried in an earthen pit and covered up. And you see those smoking rocks there. They have started a fire underneath those rocks, and that smoke is going to permeate into the agave that are surrounded around the outside of the pit there. And that is one thing that is very unique about mezcal. But I'll leave that to that section when we get there. But those are two different cooking methods with agave. Here's another one. It's called an autoclave. This is essentially like a microwave, as opposed to the previous slides where we see like an oven. So it's done with more industrial type agaves when we want to really get it done quickly. And we will definitely discuss this more on Tequila Day. So let's move on to the process of fermentation. This is essentially the process through which sugars become alcohol. Produces ethyl alcohol, otherwise known as ethanol, which is very important to us in terms of this class. Okay. Also carbon dioxide and other byproducts, including heat. Fermentation can be initiated through the induced or natural inclusion of the yeast. Typically, it's done through induced controlled settings. So certain distilleries are going to have their own type of yeast that they use, certain variety, things like that. As you can see in that center picture, center below there, you have yeast actually bubbling up. That's the carbon dioxide rising throughout there. Kind of looks like a witch's brew. And then a nice little analogy that we can use to explain what's going on with the process of fermentation in terms of the yeast is Thelma and Louise. And essentially they're having fun until the fun is over. The yeast will continue to produce ethanol until about 16% ABV, where they will essentially die in their own waste. There are some yeasts that can produce higher than that, but that's more outside the scope of this class. But typically they're going to hit about 14 to 16% and then die out. Okay. But wait, there's more. There are some things that are produced other than alcohol and carbon dioxide. So these somethings are going to be congeners. These are important in spirit production as they add distinct aromas and flavors to the finished product. The raw material in different varieties and or species of yeast produce many congeners, as you can imagine. Okay, there's a list of different congeners, acids, aldehydes, esters, other compounds. So these are going to produce flavors. For instance, if you're making a Sauvignon Blanc, you're going to get a flavor of jalapenos in there, this vegetable type flavor. That is produced by the interaction from the grapes and the different types of yeast. They're going to produce that. Certain types of lambics, things like that, and beers. Although beers are more outside the scope of this class and wine too. I'm just using that as an example. Not a congener, but lees can also that's produced during fermentation can influence the flavor of the spirit as well. Producers can choose to keep the lees within the distilled product, or they can take them out. Provides a little more body sometimes. Okay. Also, too, some other things that are produced during fermentation that you do not want, or in very, very trace amounts, are called fusel oils. Okay. First one is methanol. Some other ones, amyl alcohol, and propyl isobutyl alcohol. And those are just certain types of fusel oils. Now, these fusel oils can contribute some flavor, but are typically eliminated during the cutting stage of distillation, where the heads and tails are cut because they contain some of these harmful alcohols and compounds. These fusel oils either have a lower boiling point called heads. When we do the cuts, when we make the head cut, these are going to have lower boiling point fusel oils. You do not want them in the finished product. For instance, you don't want methanol in your finished. Say if you're making a gin, you don't want methanol in there. Could make you go blind, and essentially, and in more amounts could cause death. Okay. Also, too, some of these fusel oils have a higher boiling point than ethanol, and these are going to be cut off in the tails. Okay, when we talk about distillation, the heads and tails are different types of cuts. Okay, ethanol has a boiling point of 173 Fahrenheit, and some of these things are going to have higher and lower boiling points than ethanol. So we'll have that's upon the determination of the master distiller. So that brings us to distillation. What is distillation? It's a separation of alcohol from water through a process called distillation. Now, a very important numbers that you can remember, if you remember anything, are the boiling points of alcohol or ethanol, which is 173 Fahrenheit or 78 degrees Celsius. So water has a boiling point of 212, 100 respectively. So you're using this knowledge of boiling points to separate the ethanol from the water, okay? The term comes from the Latin word distillare, which translates as trickle down and refers to the drops of condensed liquid that form during the distillation process. Distillation has been used for hundreds of years to produce beverages with a higher alcohol by volume, or otherwise known as ABV. Okay. And the name where this process takes place is called a distillery. This is the Glenmorangie Distillery right here. So there's different ways we can do distillation. The first and the most, the first ways that we could do it is the most ancient ways actually, is through pot distillation, otherwise known as batch distillation. So batch distillation is a process which involves the heating of a liquid containing different compounds, each with different boiling points. So if we look in the heating element, right above that, we have a container where the mash is. So this is going to be your any type of raw material that we've fermented. In case, say, like a whiskey, you would have your wort in there. You're going to heat that up, and there's water in there. So you want to heat it up to that 173 to get the alcohol to rise through the vapor, and then it follows through the different apparatus there. It eventually ends up in the condenser. So in the condenser there, it's cooled back down, and the ethanol is collected in the collector. Batch distillation is typically carried out through a pot still. Batch distillation produces more flavorful spirits such as whiskey or gin. So batch distillation or pot still distillation, you want more character. Okay, it's going to be less efficient because we have to, every time we want to distill something, we have to take out the spent mash, clean it out, put in a new mash, and start the process all over again. So it's less efficient, but it yields a more flavorful product, if that makes sense. Okay. The distillate, which contains the desired amount of alcohol, is collected and allowed to age as per the distiller's requirements. There's different types of stills out there. This one is called a alembic Chiantes, which is used in cognac production. And we will definitely delve into that when we get into cognac, but essentially it's a two-stage batch distillation where you have the first distillation happen on the apparatus on the left. The alcohol flows into the center, almost looks like an onion. It gets distilled again, so to a higher percentage, okay, and then gets collected in the condenser on the far right there. Again, there's more to it than that, but we're gonna discuss that later. This is the example of a continuous still. So we mentioned this kind of in the history of alcohol in the beginning, but in the 18th century, in the early 19th century, we see the column still being developed. Okay, this was a huge leap for alcohol production, especially distilled spirits. And we'll see on the next slide why that is. Essentially, the column still provides continuous distillation, meaning it's an uninterrupted process. The liquid containing compounds with different boiling points are continuously fed into the still, and fractions are removed continuously. Continuous distillation can run steadily and requires minimal maintenance. Continuous distillation also provides a more light and more neutral spirit. Okay, so these are used in more industrial spirits. If you're trying to make a vodka or a very neutral rum, you're going to use this column still. If you need to make a lot of it and you want to make it neutral, you're going to want to choose continuous distillation. So there's a diagram right there on the far left. You see the different plates. So essentially the raw material gets fed in through the top, and it comes down the plates, and each time it hits the plates, it gets fractionally distilled until it can go to the condenser. It's kind of a abstract thing what's happening there. And I had a movie, but it doesn't look like it's okay. There we go. So let me see if it plays. Maybe not. I don't know if I can get this to play here, but I had a movie, and I was going to show you because it helps to see kind of what's going on here because it's kind of a abstract type of thing, but there's a glass type of column still, and I wish the movie would work, but that's okay. Um, I can send a link to Levio and he can share it with y'all so you can see what's happening because it's hard to see through a diagram, or if you're looking at an actual still, which is right here, that's a column still, it's hard to see what's going on unless you're there. Okay, so that movie is going to help, but that's all right. We'll keep moving on. Okay, and this one is going to be a vacuum distillation right there. So what this does is it's going to work on the process or on the principle of pressure. Okay, so there's a term in chemistry, I remember in physics, where it's an indirect relationship. So pressure has an indirect relationship with boiling point, meaning that as you increase the pressure, you're going to lower the boiling point of which you're increasing the pressure on. In this case, we're increasing the pressure on the alcohol. It's going to lower the boiling point. So vacuum distillation is this distillation performed under reduced pressure. It lowers the external above liquids so that distillation can happen at lower temperatures. It allows the purification of compounds not readily distilled at ambient pressures, or it's simply used to save time or energy. And why would you want to do this? Well, say if you're using very delicate materials to be flavored with, typically if you're making a gin or say a liqueur and you have very delicate materials like a flour that's very delicate, boiling that is going to destroy it. And you really want to preserve those botanicals and those aromas within the delicate materials. You don't want to damage them by heat. So you would use vacuum distillation in that process. Next step in production after distillation is flavoring. So you would want to use flavoring for things such as liqueurs, gins, certain types of flavored spirits, okay? But this is an optional step. When you're in terms of spirits, a lot of flavor you're going to get are going to come from the raw material and or aging. We'll talk about it later. Herbs, spices, and aromatics can be added to further enhance the product. In the ancient world, flavoring was added to cover off flavors and give alcohol medicinal properties. Next step is blending and marrying. Okay, the combination of mixing one or more various alcohols is called blending. This is done to encourage consistency among the product. Some producers have a master blender in-house that's all they do. They get a number of different distillates or eau de vies, and they make sure that it tastes and smells consistent. Okay, so if I'm making a certain VSOP cognac, it's got to taste the same way exact every time. So this is their job. A producer may blend 40 or more varieties of distillates from various regions, vintages, or barrels to obtain specific characteristics in the final product. And one of the very last steps is called dilution. So some of these products come off the still very high in ABV. Some of them up to 95%, which is 190 proof. That would be difficult to drink even for myself. So in order to make this alcohol drinkable, water is added to make the spirit to decrease the alcohol percentage to the desired ABV. The majority of spirits that we'll be trying and across the board are going to be around 40% or 80 proof. So it's 40% ethanol, and the other 60%, the majority of it's going to be water, probably like 99% of it. So water is a very essential consideration when you're making a distilled product. Next up is aging. So this is the process of storing alcohol, whether it be in clay pots, barrels, or bottles. Exposes it to both air and the storage container for longer periods of time. The process is taking advantage of both the air and the container's influence on the alcohol. It also changes the alcohol's color, aroma, and flavor in a variety of beneficial ways. Okay. So another thing to consider too, alcohol is probably one of the strongest solvents. So what does that mean? It extracts flavors, and we're going to use that quality of alcohol to extract flavor from the storage vessel. The anatomy of the barrel there, it's got different compositions there, and that's just how the barrel is made. One big thing there is the stave. If you look there, it has a char. That's very important to whiskey production to an extent with brandy production, but definitely with American whiskeys like bourbons, they're going to char their barrels to a very high temperature. Sometimes up to a level 4 char, which is called the alligator char. This char is going to go within the oak and caramelize a lot of those sugars. That's the way why whiskey has flavors of butterscotch, caramel, vanilla. That's all attributed from the oak. So, and there are 6 processes of spirit maturation. We'll go into those later. Just a quick note about aging and maturation. These terms I see sometimes getting used symbiotically, I guess, or there's some kind of confusion between them, but just know that aging is more of a quantitative number. So say my whiskey is aged for 6 years. That's the term we use for aging. Now, maturation is a different term, okay? Maturations are the qualities that you want from a spirit. Say you want it to have an oxidative flavor, it's going to have flavors of caramel. And once it reaches that, we can now say it's matured. And these matured qualities come about through the process of maturation. Another way to put it is like this. My daughter and I, we are different ages. She is going to be 17, and I just turned 46. She is definitely more mature than I. I still get a kick out of like toilet humor and like people falling, and like, you have these internet clips of people falling down when they're skating. Haha, that's very funny. And just it's my daughter, she rolls her eyes at me. I still get a kick out of the word gnarly, and she does not like that. She is definitely more mature than I. So you can use that analogy when you're referring to spirits as well. It might be aged a certain number, but that maturation has more qualitative characteristics with it, if that makes sense. And then lastly, we come to bottling, canning, and packaging. When we're talking about spirits here, and for our context, the majority are going to be glass bottles, just because glass bottles are non-reactive. Just to let you know, some people think that spirits keep aging when in the bottle. That's not true. Once they go in the bottle, the age is cut off. So if it's been aged in the barrel for 12 years and it hits the bottle, you got to put 12 years on there. Unless there's a younger whiskey in there as a blend, you'd have to use that. But we'll save that for another class, okay? And as you can see, we have some different liquor bottles here. So each one kind of tells a different story in which you're trying to accomplish. A lot of how can I put this? Marketing is put into different packaging and different bottles to give a story. So if you look at the bottle in the center there, the Grand Patron there, Piedra, it's got a very elegant bottle, a very nice presentation. So they're trying to achieve a certain look to it. Okay, if you look at the Luxardo bottle on the right, they're trying to achieve a different type of message, kind of more of a crafty type of, maybe, some old lady, she probably weaved this bottle, this basket around this bottle, and you want to try to convey that craftiness of the product to convey a sense of quality. Okay, so packaging is very important to a spirit. Again, you're trying to get this message across, whether it's marketing or it can be anything aesthetic too. It can be functional too. Is it easy for a bartender to grab in the speed rack? So a lot of considerations are done towards bottling. So that wraps up the history of alcohol and manufacturing of spirits. Thank you so much for listening to me. And I can't wait to meet you all in the next coming weeks and share with you my knowledge of spirits and alcohol production and all things bartending. I hope to share some really cool cocktails with you as well. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and we will see you in the following weeks.